Gold was not new to Africa when Europeans arrived. For centuries, gold held great meaning. It symbolized power for kings and queens. Used to create beautiful art and jewelry, civilizations like Egypt and Nubia valued gold. West African empires such as Ghana, Mali, and Songhai were famous for their gold. This gold was part of their culture and traditions. It was a source of pride and wealth. African kingdoms controlled rich gold fields. They traded gold across the Sahara Desert, connecting West Africa with North Africa, the Middle East, and Europe. Mansa Musa, Mali's emperor, was legendary for his wealth. His pilgrimage to Mecca showcased immense gold resources. He distributed so much gold in Cairo that its value dropped. African goldsmiths were highly skilled. They created intricate objects showing deep knowledge of their craft. This gold was transformed into items of beauty and significance. Before European mining, Africans had their own methods. Often small-scale, they panned for gold in rivers, digging shallow pits to find gold deposits. The first Europeans to systematically seek African gold were the Portuguese. They arrived on the West African coast in the 15th century. Around the 1470s, they began trading for gold. They established forts and trading posts along the coast. One such place became known as the Gold Coast, now Ghana. This name showed how important gold was to the Europeans. Initially, the trade was somewhat on African terms. Europeans offered goods like cloth, tools, and beads in exchange for gold dust and ornaments. Africans controlled the supply from the interior mines. However, this early trade soon began to change. European powers grew more hungry for gold. The Portuguese were joined by the Dutch, the British, and the French. Each nation wanted its own share of Africa's wealth. The competition between them was fierce. They sought more direct access to the gold sources. They wanted to control the trade, not just participate in it. This shift marked the beginning of a more aggressive European involvement in Africa. The desire for gold was a major driving force behind their expanding presence. It was no longer just about simple exchange. The late 19th century saw the scramble for Africa. European powers formally divided the continent among themselves. The Berlin Conference of 1884 to 1885 was a key moment. At this meeting, European nations made rules for claiming African territory. No Africans were invited to this conference. Gold-rich regions were particularly prized. Countries like Britain, France, Belgium, and Germany rushed to claim areas known or suspected to have gold. This formal colonization made it easier for them to take Africa's resources. It was a systematic plan for control. Once colonial rule was established, new laws were put in place. These laws were designed to help Europeans get the gold. African land ownership systems were often ignored or dismantled. Large areas of land, especially those with minerals, were declared property of the colonial government or European companies. Africans were pushed off their ancestral lands. Mining concessions were granted to European businesses. These companies received exclusive rights to dig for gold. With colonial power firmly established, Europeans changed how gold was mined. Traditional African methods were small-scale and often surface-based. The colonizers introduced large-scale industrial mining. They brought new technologies that Africans did not have access to or control over. Dynamite was used to blast through rock. Powerful mechanical crushers were imported to break down ore. Deep-level mining techniques were developed to reach gold seams far underground. This industrial approach allowed for much greater quantities of gold to be extracted. It was a revolution in the scale of exploitation. One common method was open-pit mining. This involved digging huge pits in the ground to reach gold deposits near the surface. Enormous amounts of soil and rock were removed. This method drastically changed the landscape. Large machines like steam shovels were used. Open-pit mines left massive, visible scars on the earth. They were far more destructive than the small pits dug by traditional African miners. Focus was purely on getting the gold out as quickly and cheaply as possible for the European companies. The environmental impact was not a major concern for the colonizers. Extracting gold from the African earth was only one part of the colonial project. The next crucial step was to transport this immense wealth out of Africa. The gold mines were often located deep in the interior of the continent. This presented significant logistical challenges for the colonial powers. They needed efficient ways to move large quantities of gold ore or refined gold to the coastal ports. From there, it could be shipped to Europe. This need for efficient transport shaped much of the infrastructure development during the colonial period. It was a system designed for export. To overcome these challenges, colonial administrations invested in building railways and roads. However, these transport networks were not created for the benefit of African populations. Their primary purpose was to serve the economic interests of the colonizing nations. Railways were laid down from mining areas directly to the ports. They often bypassed existing African settlements and trade routes. African labor, frequently forced or very poorly paid, was used to construct these railways and roads. The infrastructure itself became another tool of exploitation, facilitating the removal of Africa's treasure. Once the gold reached the ports, specialized shipping lines took over. The extraction of gold under colonial rule came at a terrible human cost. African labor was the backbone of the mining industry, but African workers were treated inhumanely. Colonial authorities and mining companies used various methods to get workers. Often, it was forced labor. In other cases, systems like hut taxes or poll taxes were imposed. These taxes had to be paid in cash. The only way for many African men to earn this cash was to work in the European-owned mines. This forced them to leave their homes, their farms, and their families for long periods. Working conditions in the colonial gold mines were appalling. African miners worked long, grueling hours. They received extremely low wages, often barely enough to survive. They worked in dangerous environments with little or no safety equipment. Rockfalls, dynamite explosions, and machinery accidents were common. The mines were often deep, dark, hot, and poorly ventilated. European supervisors enforced harsh discipline. There was little concern for the well-being or safety of the African workforce. The priority was always to maximize gold output and profits for the European owners. The large-scale gold mining introduced by European colonizers caused severe damage to the African environment. To clear land for the mines and to get timber for mine supports and fuel, vast areas of forest were cut down. This deforestation had many negative effects. It destroyed the habitats of local animals and plants, leading to a loss of biodiversity. Without trees to hold the soil together, heavy rains caused soil erosion. Fertile topsoil was washed away, making the land unsuitable for farming. The landscape was permanently altered by these activities. Water pollution was another serious consequence of colonial mining. The chemicals used to process gold ore, such as mercury and cyanide, were often released directly into rivers and streams. These toxic substances poisoned the water. Aquatic life, including fish that local people relied on for food, was killed. The polluted water also posed a direct threat to the health of African communities who used it for drinking, cooking, and washing. Colonial mining companies showed little concern for these environmental impacts. The immense profits generated from African gold did not stay in Africa. They were systematically repatriated to Europe. The colonial mining companies were owned by Europeans. The banks that financed them were European. The shareholders who received dividends were European. Very little of this wealth was reinvested in the genuine development of African societies. Colonial economies were deliberately structured to facilitate this outward flow of resources. Roads and railways led to ports, not to internal markets. Education and health services for Africans were minimal, as they were not seen as essential for resource extraction. Under colonial rule, African economies were forced into a position of dependency. They were made to specialize in producing one or two raw materials, like gold, cocoa, or cotton, for export to Europe. This prevented the development of diversified local economies. There was no encouragement for local manufacturing or industries that could process these raw materials within Africa. As a result, African colonies became reliant on Europe for manufactured goods, which they had to buy at high prices. Today, in 2025, Africa remains a key gold producer globally. Many African countries still possess significant gold reserves. Large-scale mining operations are often run by multinational corporations. A significant portion of the profits flows out of the continent. Ensuring Africa's mineral wealth benefits its people remains a challenge. Old patterns of resource extraction persist. Artisanal and small-scale mining, or ASM, has grown significantly. Millions depend on ASM for their livelihood. This mining is often informal and unregulated. It faces serious problems, including poor working conditions. Issues include dangerous conditions, mercury use, and child labor. Addressing these issues is vital for sustainable development. African nations strive for fairer deals with international companies. They work to secure a greater share of the revenue. Efforts are made to improve environmental regulations. Improving labor conditions and protecting workers' rights is crucial. Combating illegal gold smuggling remains a major challenge.